series of virtual panels focused on identifying key housing issues and opportunities in the city. My name is Gabriel Edelman. I'm an assistant professor and director of the Urban Policy Lab at the University of Toronto, and your moderator for today's session, which I should remind everyone is available with some closed captioning. Just look to the bottom left corner of your window on your screen. There's a little button that says CC, and you should be able to press that, and some closed captioning will show up for maximum accessibility. Today, as most of you know, is National Housing Day, which I believe has extended into National Housing Week. And for the people on this panel and in this audience, is probably every day is National Housing Day. And the nature of the housing crisis means that every year is National Housing Year. But National Housing Day is meant to raise awareness and improve access to affordable housing. So in that vein, our friends at the City of Toronto's Housing Secretariat have put together today's panel to showcase the impressive work of various community partners and advocates from the Indigenous, nonprofit, health, business, and academic sectors that have made real contributions to housing innovation. Before I introduce our guests, two important acknowledgements. First, as a City of Toronto event, it's important to acknowledge that the land I'm speaking to today is the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat, and these are lands covered by Treaty 13 with Mississaugas of the Credit. Second, in support of the City of Toronto's ongoing efforts to confront and combat anti-Black racism, I'd also like to acknowledge that not all settlers came to these lands voluntarily. And so as you take in today's conversation, I encourage everyone to be mindful of how housing policies may disproportionately impact Black, as well as other racialized communities in our city. With that said, I'd like to introduce our expert panelists. Full bios are available on this event website, but a few words on each of our guests. First, we have Chief Jason Gauthier, Chief of the Missinaibi Cree First Nation, first elected in 2013 and re-elected several times since. Chief Gauthier will kick things off in a moment by describing a partnership between his nation and Ellis Don to build Toronto's first Indigenous-led Housing Now project for Indigenous elders. Next, we have Heather Tremaine, CEO of Options for Homes, Canada's largest developer of affordable ownership housing, I should say. Heather will share with us her observations on the kinds of partnerships that have helped Options for Homes grow its development pipeline to over $850 million. Third is Joshua Baynard, Vice President of Real Estate Development at Habitat for Humanity. Joshua serves as executive lead at Community Affordable Housing Solutions, a new not-for-profit land trust partnership between Habitat GTA, St. Clair's Multi-Faith Housing Society, and the Co-op Housing Federation of Canada, which recently received $17 million in seed funding and secured more than 200 units of affordable housing via land trust. And finally, we have Derek Goring, Executive Vice President of Development at Northcrest Development, which is responsible for master planning the Downsview Airport lands, a site many would be surprised to know, which is roughly equivalent in size to downtown Toronto, if I have that right, Derek, which is quite incredible. So Derek will walk us through how the Public Sector Pension Investment Board and the Canada Lands Company, a federal crown corporation, came together to reimagine Downsview, which includes a substantial affordable housing component. So welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to everyone in the audience as well. We'll kick things off with some opening remarks from each panelist just to get us started, to share more details about one or more particular projects that they have helped lead and spearhead that includes partnerships and innovations, the focus of today's event. So Chief Jason Gauthier, as mentioned, you've partnered with Ellis Don to construct the first Indigenous-led project as part of the city's Housing Now program, which will include, if I have this correctly, 184 new rental homes for Indigenous elders, 50% of which will be affordable. So I wonder, Chief Gauthier, if you could tell us a bit more about how the partnership was formed and some of the important lessons from your experience.
Thank you. And first, I wanted to thank everybody for the opportunity to speak about partnerships and the First Nations and how we get into these partnerships and how they'll be able to help what's happening in the housing with housing in Toronto. I did want to mention that we got involved with Ellis Don through a a bid to create this project on Merton Street. I think that we were very concerned about the housing crisis in Toronto in regards to the elders of our communities not having access to affordable housing. It was a conversation that we've had over the years with our community members, and we sort of got a push and a mandate to look for innovations in order to alleviate the issues that we're having in these areas. So the partnership was a good partnership with Alistan. We had some initial conversations with them. We talked to them about what we could build, and we also talked about how the partnership could work out for both the Alistan and the Missinabie Cree. So we made a decision to move forward, and we put our application in. We were successful, and now we're looking at getting this project off the ground so that we can have housing in Toronto within the next couple of years.
So can you, just to follow up on that, so it's an application based, just for those new, listening in, that process of you put your application in, what was the spark there to make sure that you could make that connection with Elliston?
Well, we were actually quite surprised when we were successful in the application process with Alistan, and I think that when we did it, it was to for First Nations to get involved in what's happening in development in Toronto, and I think we were quite intrigued with the idea. We like I said, we met with Alistan. We said, this be great for First Nations, and partnerships, and also with the city of Toronto. So we were happy to put in the application, and like I said, we were successful.
Great. That gives us a start to go on here, and we'll see throughout the day, audience, kind of the diversity of partnerships involved here, and this is a good segue to bring in Heather here from Options for Homes, which is an organization that focuses a lot on affordable home ownership through partnership, right, with organizations such as Van City Community Investment Bank, etc. So, question to you, Heather, to kick us off, from your perspective, how crucial have partnerships been, and how have they helped your organization bring more affordable ownership opportunities online for people who are typically left out of the ownership market?
Thanks, Gabriel. It's great to be here today, and great to share some of the insights we've learned. We're a 28-year-old organization, so it's great to be able to share a little bit of what we've learned over the years. I think there are a couple of, probably three key relationships or partnerships that we've had that have really helped us grow in different buckets. One of the biggest ones is probably our partnership with Delterra, which is the third-party construction arm of Tridel. They have been our builder for 20 years now, and there's a sort of funny story of them, of Angelo Delzato, who's one of the tries of Tridel, or one of the Dells of Tridel, I should say, and he knew the founder of Options, and we were finishing a building 20 odd years ago, and he sent one of his key staff down to see what our building looked like, and people were living in it, but it was still under construction. And the person, Mario Simicata is his name, came back and said to Angelo and to Mike LeBay, who founded Options, we could help you. We could really help you. And so they became our builder. And in more than just a builder, what they do with us is, we meet with them every Monday morning That's kind of one of the first things on our agenda. They, we make the decisions on options. We, secure the land, but they're an organization that has obviously very big reach in the community. So we will talk through a new acquisition with them. If we have something that, a challenge on a project, we can go to them and sort of bring in their expertise. And so I think I can safely say if we didn't have that kind of partnership with them, we wouldn't be able to produce what we have produced. They build for us, on a fixed price contract, which is kind of relatively unheard of. And without, and we have access to the buying power of Tridel. So those are all huge benefits that we have gleaned from this relationship, and they've been incredibly generous and gracious with us over the years. They would never trumpet the partnership. They don't they showed up in their corporate social responsibility report, but just of late, really, and so they've been amazing partners. The other kinds of partnerships we have, you touched on it a little bit, Gabriel. We have, I would call it less of a partnership, but a strong relationship. So we've built strong relationships with lenders. Van City Investment Bank has been one of our lenders over the last number of years. We have very good relationships in the credit union, amongst credit unions, and also some of the kind of charter banks, but really building strong relationships so they understand our model, because what our structure is different than a typical for-profit developer. So really kind of going in deep and building those relationships. So when you present a project, they know how to deal with it. We can work through some of the just nuances successfully together, and so those have been great relationships. The other group is really, we work with a range of landowners. So we're buying land. We've bought land from churches, and in many cases we've been able to create partnerships where the church can delay the payment for the site, which reduces the amount of equity that we need to put into a project. Right now we're building, or we're in the process of developing a site where we will rebuild a church facility for a church, and then we will build housing. We did another project where we bought the parking lot of a church, which was really underutilized land, and built. And right now we have a number of MOUs with landowners who have very large sites, who we're partnered with them, or we'll be partnering with them to deliver housing as part of a larger master plan community. So I think I would say our success is really attributed to those kinds of key partnerships and relationships.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Heather. And bringing in all kinds of different sectors already, you can see the diversity here of different groups. Next, we have Joshua to help us understand the Habitat perspective here. Habitat for Humanity GTA launched, as I mentioned, the Community Affordable Housing Solutions Land Trust in 2019. Tell us more, Joshua, about how this land trust model works, the partners required, and why you think this model can address some of our housing issues in the city.
Yeah. So when I joined Habitat back in 2019, I think we had about 3 or 4 different partners with the private sector. But quickly I realized that kind of everything that we do hinges around partnerships. So we partner with the city in terms of funding, federal government as well. We partner with developers, our families, we call them partner families, that are actually taking ownership of the units. So everything for us at every stage of a project is a partnership, and just building on that, again, when I arrived in 2019, we had 4 partnerships with the private sector in terms of developers where they've provided turnkey units or land to develop. We now have 25 different partnerships with the private sector, with about 15 other developers that we're in discussions with. So a big part of our business now is, working with the developer to get units within their building, land as part of a larger development, or some sort of combination of both. So in 2019, effectively through these discussions with the developer, we were looking at how we could get units on their site, and ultimately we realized kind of the best case scenario for this site, which had already dedicated a large park space and community space, as well as a tower of affordable housing, that we could take some cash in lieu off-site and reinvest that and leverage that in 50% of it in Ward 9 and the other 50% across the city of Toronto. So that was at the end of 2019. 2020, we incorporated right at the beginning of COVID. So it was a bit of a challenge to get started, but we now have 200 units confirmed, and we've only spent half of our $17 million, which we had anticipated we would only get about 180 units total. So the fact that we're able to leverage this funding and do more, we're doing affordable home ownership within our land trust. We're doing affordable co-op housing, affordable rental housing. So it's kind of the complete continuum of housing, which offers developers and the city kind of a one-stop shop, so that, you know, if we're having a conversation about how to make it work on one site, what we've actually found recently is I'm now starting to talk to developers about, you know, 3 or 4 sites at the same time, which is, again, in terms of economy of scale, it really helps because we're using the same term sheet and process to kind of get a very quick turnaround time. And the quickest one that we've done, where we put it together and had it all settled and you know, shook hands on it, was about 4 or 5 months. And in that case, the developer said, like, this was much faster than any kind of experience that they had gone through with a Section 37 or Section 45 negotiation. And that's largely because we were right in the middle of it, negotiating between the developer and the city. And then we put our name to it. We say that this is a good deal. We're supporting this both in the public realm, but as well with the city. So I think it helps to have, you know, an organization like CAS that comes from 3 different organizations with over kind of 100 years of affordable housing experience, saying, you know, this is a good deal and we should make this happen. So I think it's been an exciting kind of process, and it will be interesting to see how this organization grows. But in terms of Habitat, the other thing I just wanted to flag is we are now starting to partner with other nonprofit organizations. You know, we actually are working with Heather, and we have 26 units in one of their developments, which is a fantastic opportunity for Habitat. But on the flip side, we're actually in the process of completing 26 townhomes on a larger Habitat site in Durham region as part of the Rapid Housing Initiative that we're building. Habitat is self-performing for another nonprofit. And anybody that knows Rapid Housing Initiative knows that it's supposed to be always built in 12 months, which was a bit of a pipe dream. But I will say that we are doing I think in terms of scheduling, we are behind because of strikes and shortages of materials and things of that nature, but we are not that far behind. So when we were talking to somebody the other day, they said that we're actually kind of one of the better examples of a project being completed on time. So I think when you take profit out of the discussion, you can have some really interesting opportunities, like, for example, Habitat and Options for Homes working together, because we have this shared vision. And when there is profit involved, there's also an equally interesting opportunity with the private sector that I would encourage nonprofits to explore.
Well, that's a great tee up, I think, for a later conversation as well. We can come back to that because that might be a new concept to some in the audience as well. So rounding out the panel here, we come to Derek, your organization, Derek, Northcrest Developments, if I understand correctly, is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Public Sector Pension Investment Board and has worked with Canada Lands Company to develop a master plan for Downsview. So tell our audience a little bit more about how you worked with partners to create the foundation for such a large scale development.
Sure, thanks, Gabriel. Yeah, and just for those of you who are not familiar, the Public Sector Pension Plan is the fourth largest pension fund in Canada. They manage the pensions of the Federal Public Service, the RCMP, and the Armed Forces. And so as a subsidiary of PSP, our mandate is the redevelopment of the Downsview Airport lands. PSP purchased those lands from Bombardier in 2018. Bombardier is actually still on site assembling aircraft and using the runway that's there to test those airplanes. So that's still happening today, but they are moving to Pearson in the next year or so. And so we have been working with Canada Lands Company, which owns lands adjacent to the airport lands. And collectively, we've developed a vision for that site, which represents over 500 acres of land next to 3 existing subway stations and just north of the 401 and just west of Allen Road. Our vision is to create essentially a new piece of the city of Toronto, which will eventually house over 80,000 people. From the beginning of the process, we recognized that affordable housing was really important in creating successful, complete communities. So Northcrest's role is really the master developer, and strategic partnerships are really important to how we think about how to deliver on the vision. And housing is one example of where strategic partnerships are really important. So we're very focused on creating complete communities, and that includes providing a wide variety of housing types and tenures across the whole affordability spectrum. And our intention is to work with private developers, the nonprofit sector, to deliver affordable housing options and other housing options. And one of the benefits that we think about is the scale of Downsview. It's quite a unique situation to have such a large site right in the middle of the city of Toronto. And so what we're trying to do is figure out how to leverage that scale and work with a variety of different partners and address different needs. So for example, from a demographic perspective, there's been a lot of focus and discussion on accommodating seniors. We're having various conversations with Indigenous people. We've had conversations with artists and with the accessibility community to make sure that all of those needs can be addressed in a project the size of Downsview. So we want to leverage the expertise of all these organizations to deliver on the vision that we've set out, and we're really focused on finding partners whose values and interests align with that. And we think that by working collaboratively with all those different people, developers, the nonprofit sector, governments, and our pension fund owner, that we can deliver on creative solutions that address all those different housing needs. And you can think about these on an individual basis, and I think traditionally that's been a big focus. But ideally for Downsview, we can think about things a bit more strategically and ambitiously to create neighborhood scale solutions, and that's what's really exciting to me. The reality is Downsview is so big that we can't do it on our own, and we really need to work with partners. So that's fundamental to the way we think about this project.
That's wonderful. Okay, so that's a large lay of the land here, right? I was trying on the side, and I'm sure audience members were doing this too, trying to keep track of all the partnerships that were just mentioned here, right? So, we had Chief Goche. We're looking at a First Nation partnering with a private sector firm in order to build what is essentially kind of a city-initiated project, right? So partnerships with private sector and government. We have Heather, who run a not-for-profit organization and partners or has good relations, as you put it, Heather, with either other private sector, either construction firms like Delterra or financial institutions and lenders, etc. But also community groups and sometimes faith-based groups, right? In partnerships with those churches and other kind of organizations in terms of land purchasing, etc. We have Joshua again from the not-for-profit perspective, but a whole whack of partnerships here. What did you mention? 25 different partnerships. You mentioned, Joshua, touching on from the private sector, different government partners as well. You mentioned Rapid Housing Initiative, et cetera. There's a municipal angle to that as well. And then finally, we have Eric coming from a pension perspective, a public pension fund, which exists in that gray area in life of ours of kind of public and private all at the same time, if you think about that. And then also through the Crown Corporation component, working clearly with Bombardier as a precursor there, but also reaching out and suggesting that there will have to require many more partnerships just to meet the scale of that group. So there, we've covered the full. I can't think of any other types of partnerships here. What an amazing job the organizers did here to give us the full scope of things. And so maybe to kind of probe this a little bit further, we can go through our group one more time with one or two follow-up questions. And then I've been jotting down a few questions as well, if there's time that we can kind of get some engagement between the groups, because I suspect that partnerships might emerge just even from these conversations, just from what I was hearing in terms of some of these stories. So maybe just coming back around to Chief Gauthier on this theme of partnership, but in particular picking up on innovation. In your experience, what are one of the lessons learned here in terms of what is a key innovation that we should be thinking about that would make a difference in terms of addressing the housing needs, specifically of Indigenous peoples and First Nations in the Toronto area? What's something that the audience should really be keeping in mind in terms of how to engage with First Nations and Indigenous groups?
I think that we touched on something really really important when it comes to what we're doing in Toronto and we're doing in other places. I know that Missinabbi Cree has, as in the theme of partnerships, we have over 60 different partnerships that we deal with in mining and the resource development sector. We have joint venture partnerships. We have LLPs. We have newcos. We create all these partnerships in order for the community to benefit from whatever's happening on the landscape, and not just in our traditional territory, but any partnerships that would be not only advantageous to the First Nation to be part of, but also to the developers and the other side of the partnerships. I think that the theme of partnerships is not surprising coming out of this, is because doing things together has always been something that the First Nations have been trying to do for for a long time. I think that it takes a little bit of um, we take a little bit of risk sometimes when we get involved with some partnerships. I think that generally we're always trying to make sure that we understand our partners, we spend time with our partners, and we create a relationship. Our partners are sometimes not just partners but friends to the community, and I think that we see that through sponsorships. We see it through investments directly into the First Nation community. I think that when we look at the I think that times are changing. I think that when industry looks at the First Nations, they should be engaging with First Nations and talking to them about how they can work together. I think that the First Nations are willing to do that. I think that in my experience, I work with the Chiefs of Ontario, 133 First Nations on economic development, and in that group, we're always looking for opportunities to partner with developers, with companies to make sure that not only our communities are successful, but that it's a mutually advantageous partnership.
And you mentioned risk there. So from your perspective, obviously there's risks at the outset of some of these partnerships, potential partnerships. What are you looking for in a potential partner to alleviate some of those risks?
Well, I think integrity is probably one things that we're looking for in each of our partnerships. I think that, you know, if the goal and the vision of the company aligns with the First Nation, then I think that may be a good partnership. But I think it takes time to get to know your partners. It takes time to feel more comfortable that there is less risk in that partnership. I think that you know, on the flip side, you know, sometimes there isn't the best partners. You know, we've First Nations in general have encountered you know, partnerships that have not worked out so well. So, like I said, there's a process, and I think there's a change across you know, across Canada and across Ontario that you know, that the industry and and companies should be working a lot more to working out those relationships a little better than they have in the past. But the First Nations have to keep on trying to find those great relationships and those partnerships that they need to be successful.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And we might come back to if there's time, because I'd be curious to probe further on this question of what's required in order to avoid some of those mistakes and make sure those partnerships are strong and beneficial. To Heather, a question that we have here is to expand a little bit more on what you've been talking about in terms of where, you know, what else needs to happen here in terms of bringing affordable ownership opportunities online for people, the, the populations you serve who may be left out of the conventional ownership market based on you know, the market today. What else is Options for Home looking for in terms of innovation and partnerships? What would work best for you?
Sure, happy to answer that one. I mean, first of all, just maybe give some insight into who we're serving. We just did a social impact study. So we went back to our purchasers, going back to the beginning of time here at Options. And what we found was that we are serving kind of a range of populations, but 56% of our purchasers identify as BIPOC. So the group that we're serving almost exactly mirrors the Toronto population, which I think is abnormal in many ways. We know that populations of home ownership for Black communities has been on the decrease, for First Nations has been on the decrease. And that, you know, typically of homeowners, about 73% of white individuals are homeowners versus much lower numbers in other populations. So we're really trying to serve people who might not have the kind of intergenerational wealth that would allow them to become homeowners. We also serve a number of seniors, single parent families, largely women-led single parent families. So those are kind of a different demographic than are typically purchasing in the market. We also have a lot of single females who might feel more, who might just be less willing to take that leap into ownership just to take the risk on their own. So that is, you know, in some ways the groups that we want to continue to serve that we think are underserved by the market. And then, you know, our model is really in some ways a conventional development model. We're out, as I like to say, we're out hustling to find land. You know, we're doing everything at Options that a typical developer is doing, but instead of taking the profit, we are lending that to our purchasers, and that forms part of their down payment. So in many ways, the things that we need to grow are kind of additional equity. And, you know, we've been talking to government about sources of additional equity. The good thing about our model is that every every time somebody pays us back, the monies that we lend them, it comes back into the pool and produces more units. So any funding that we get on the kind of at the beginning of a project will recycle back into further production. So there's a magnifier effect of that funding. There's also, you know, we've been talking to government about guarantees. Right now, we go out into the market and borrow construction financing. So unlike many rental groups who might be able to get kind of RCFI financing, we're out borrowing that money, and which means that we need to set aside a certain amount of money that's liquid to guarantee that construction loan. So if we had access to guarantees, that would free up our capital to do more projects. And the other thing that, you know, I think could be additionally helpful, and we've been sort of discussing this with various groups, is even enabling new capital. I think one of the challenges, and I think if any of you were at the panel or the discussion last night with Anna Bilau, the challenge in our sector is that, you know, we have such huge need, and government can never deliver all the need for housing. That's just not going to happen. And we have tremendous need at different parts of the continuum, but there are some parts that really, we will always need to put money into those parts that serve, you know, kind of their shelter, that are kind of really enabling lower income people to get into rental. Like those parts are always going to need some form of subsidy, and it's going to be significant. It's going to be kind of increasingly a larger amount of money. We are at the other end of the spectrum. In many cases, we're helping people get into the market and ladder up into the market. So, you know, we don't necessarily need that kind of subsidy, but if there were enabling ways for potentially kind of guarantees that would enable other people to come to the table and provide additional equity to us and which would allow us to grow, that kind of enabling force of government, I think, could really create a lot of new housing in the affordable ownership space. And to me, the role of government is to kind of grow the pie, or that is one of the roles of government. In days gone by, there were kind of guarantees that were put behind investments into green energy, into some of the early stages of First Nations lending in this country. And I think that's, if there were some pools of capital that were there to guarantee investments in housing, I think that would go a long way to bringing in new capital that has not been interested in this sector yet in a significant way. And I think that would be a game changer for us.
Lots to chew on there, and I think we'll have time to come back to that. Thank you for that, Heather. And it leads in, I think, in an interesting way to bring Joshua into the conversation here. I have in my notes here to ask you about the Housing Journeys Reimagined initiative, which also is another way, I think, kind of, tell me if I'm wrong, kind of flips conventional thinking on its head here in terms of how to connect, you know, what homeownership opportunities look like, and building off of what Heather is talking about. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So Housing Journeys Reimagined really came out of part of my cynical side. So when I arrived at Habitat, I had come from, you know, 5 years working on building affordable rental housing, and the first question is, why aren't we doing rental? And I appreciate that we're an affordable home ownership organization, but like, let's figure out like what's the business case here, and are we on the right path? And so, you know, I challenge the organization to think a little bit differently in terms of, you know, what are we actually trying to achieve here? Is it home ownership? Is it owning a piece of paper and a mortgage, or is it the outcomes that come with that we associate with home ownership? Such as, you know, equity building and strength and stability and self-reliance, pride of ownership, tenure, things of that nature. And then the question went to, okay, if we could achieve these same qualities, but title never transferred, what would that look like? And could we serve people? You know, could we actually look at the entire continuum, housing continuum, starting from people who are either homeless or at risk of becoming homeless, and try to provide some of those qualities to them? And so CMHC funded we had a solutions lab program where we got $250,000, and we spent about 2 years going through and effectively putting together a business case for this concept. And where we did performance and looked at, you know, if you had RHI funding, what would that mean? If you had different co-investment, so looking at all the different buckets of funding, and what could that result in terms of you know, who you could serve, and what kind of equity they could pull out. And where we ended up was somebody that we came up with a bunch of different archetypes, which is just you know, a name for a category of individual in a certain financial circumstance. So anywhere from somebody that was kind of currently homeless, but that was employable, so not necessarily hard to house with mental health and addiction issues, but somebody that was homeless because of circumstance, and they could get employment if they only had a place to live that was stable. You know, after 5 years of effectively paying rent, they would get a rebate back from of their rent of about $5,000, and for that individual, $5,000 was hugely meaningful, based on kind of research that we had done and other examples that had been done out in Vancouver. And then we scaled that all the way to somebody that's making, you know, $60,000. But the whole concept was that it's actually through a co-op model. So you kind of have that sense of community where there isn't necessarily a landlord. You're a co-op member, but there's a kind of a portion of it. We call it an equity building co-op. So it's not an equity co-op because it's a different concept, but you know, over a period of time, you would get access to a percentage of rebate based on a number of factors. So that is, it was an exciting journey to go through and look at how we could help people and help them kind of jump the continuum, because the way the continuum is set up and unfortunately just kind of how the way government functions is people are, you know, start at the front of the continuum and are moving through, and then something happens and then they fall back again and they have to restart. So the continuum's kind of broken in terms of how we move through it. And the one thing I'll flag is that, you know, there's examples within Habitat's partner families where we've had, you know, women, single moms who were in the shelter system, who are now homeowners, and have that stability and opportunity to grow their equity. And it's been life-changing, not just for them, but for their kids. And I think the thing that we've lost sight of, and is this isn't just about providing a home. This is people's health and well-being. You can't get better if you're fighting a cold or if you have a illness if you don't have a place to live. And I think that we need to look at, even though I focus on affordable home ownership mostly for my day job, the continuum is really important. So there's a lot of a focus on emergency shelters and you know, transitional housing and deeply affordable rent. But today, where we are in society, you know, people, the middle class is struggling to have affordable housing. Young families struggle to find affordable housing. The irony is not lost on me that I rent a home for $4,700 a month, and I work for an organization that believes in affordable home ownership, and I cannot buy a home in Toronto because I can't afford it. So you know, to me, it's less about it's less about home ownership, and it's more about the social outcomes. And I think that that's sometimes forgotten by different stakeholders. Sorry, I don't know if I answered your question. Hopefully I did.
No, you did. And looking, it's about that continuum and rethinking it. And I'd like to, if there's time, come back to that as well and open that up to others as well to speak to where the opportunities are on that continuum. But first, to Derek here, because I think, you know, a lot of the conversation in these follow-up questions have centered on finance and capital. You know, you're bringing an interesting perspective here, working through a pension fund. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more about what you see as the potential pension fund, how development.
Yeah, sure. I'll certainly touch on the pension fund connection, but I think it's worth just as additional context to set up like the large scale nature of the project that we're working on, and having a pension fund owner with a very long-term perspective is incredibly helpful to look at things a little bit differently. But in order for us to do this properly, we really had to start talking to people and doing a lot of listening to figure out what the needs were in the local community. So well before we submitted any applications to the city, we did extensive outreach to local communities, both through traditional means as well as online and virtual. And we did targeted outreach to the African, Caribbean, and Black communities who there's a very large, actually the largest concentration of ACB people in Canada is located just to the north and west of us at Downsview. So we did specific targeted outreach to them and to local youth to really understand what the needs were, what was happening in the community already, and where those gaps were. We also started developing relationships with the Indigenous community, both directly with First Nations as well as the local Indigenous groups, to understand the challenges and opportunities that are unique to them and how we might be able to work together on the redevelopment. And having all this knowledge really helped us focus on, as I said, those gaps and avoid duplicating efforts or trying things that haven't worked in the past, and leveraging the expertise and the experience of those local communities and grassroots organizations. And so this approach allows us to target our efforts and our resources and our investments in the areas that really are needed by the existing communities. When you look at Google Maps, Downsview looks like a big empty site, but the reality is there's a lot of history up there, and there are a lot of existing communities in the area, and we really need to take those into account before we start making decisions and having those communities be part of the decision-making process. And that's a concept that applies to every aspect of development, not just housing, but in particular, it's really important for housing. And so at the end of the day, I think I also have to say, I don't speak for PSB, but I think it is, as a general statement, pension funds can, I think, play an important role in affordable housing, particularly on the rental side, because rental housing, affordable rental housing, provides really good, stable income streams with low risk. There's always going to be demand for that housing, and so it's a great asset to own for owners that have a very long-term perspective, which pension funds do. But the reality is, and Heather was kind of touching on this earlier, the reality is those units can't get created in the first place without investments, and we all have to acknowledge that the pension fund's primary responsibility is to deliver pensions for the pensioners that they're responsible for. So they need to be able to generate an appropriate return. And so once the housing units get created, I think it's a really great place for those units to exist. It's my view that there isn't one solution for this either. So there's definitely a role for the nonprofit sector to own housing, and I think co-ops are another model that Josh was mentioning that I think hopefully will have a place in the future. It's been a while since too much of that has happened, and I also think there's a place for the private sector to own these assets as well. So we're actively exploring a number of different ways that the pension fund can be involved And I think it's not trying to come up with the solution. It's just looking at a whole bunch of options that might be available to leverage that patient capital and have that long-term perspective that allows us to do things that typical private sector owners can't do.
Gabriel, can I just add one thing quickly?
Of course.
I think it's really important, and Derek and you kind of mentioned this, is that whether I'm getting a debt from CMHC or a bank, there's a return. We live in a capitalistic society, and there's a dynamic that has grown where somehow the development community, who has ultimately a bunch of investors that have invested in a project, is somehow evil, and that's just not. I think it's an unfair characterization, and I think if we, got rid of all the developers and builders within our community and city and country, who would build everything? The city's not going to. Housing advocates aren't going to. So I think it's really important we recognize that as a nonprofit, we have certain objectives and skill sets, and the private sector has certain objectives and skill sets, and they shouldn't be demonized for that. It doesn't actually help the conversation. It doesn't help build more affordable housing, and it's something that, frankly, as a millennial who would love to own a home, it's incredibly frustrating that people that have owned their home for the last 30 to 40 years, who paid $200,000, $300,000, are now saying we don't want to see a high-rise building go up in our neighborhood because of a shadow, or because it's gonna in one case gentrify the community, or it's going to and by the way, sorry, the gentrification was at Yonge and Eglinton, which is just a ridiculous kind of concept. So I think it's really important in terms of understanding partnerships with the private sector and nonprofit. It's about understanding that there's going to be shared objectives, but there's also going to be different things, and it has to be, as the chief mentioned, mutually beneficial. And there's nothing wrong with making profit. That's the world we live in. Sorry, I just wanted to flag that.
No, I think that if you don't mind, I want to pick up on that and open it up to the group here, because to come back to something you mentioned, Joshua, so I take your point there, but you also mentioned in your comments that to some degree, there are also often many new opportunities available when profit isn't the driving motivation. I think that was what you mentioned. There are opportunities when you take profit, when you take off the profit equation there. So is there a balance there? And maybe open it up to the group here, maybe starting with Heather here, and then we can go to Chief Gauthier because of your work with the private sector firm in that partnership. How do you see this play out, Heather, in terms of opportunities, looking at things through kind of a for-profit or a not-for-profit lens? Is this a debate that we should be having or not?
I feel like I'm kind of in a strange straddling position where we operate in many ways like a for-profit entity. Like, we do all the things that a for-profit developer does, but we take the proceeds of our project and roll it back into new projects. So, yeah, we're kind of in many ways, I think we've always been a sort of bit of a one-off character in some ways in this space. I think there's a place for both. I think there is I think nonprofits do incredible work, and I think one thing that really should happen is more support for the nonprofit sector, because I think there is more capacity there. And the good thing about the nonprofit sector is what they're largely going to produce is permanent affordability. That is that is their kind of North Star in some ways, is building units, protecting them over the longer term that we ultimately need. I read the stat the other day that I think it was 13,000, no, I think it's 130,000 affordable rental units have been lost in the city of Toronto in the last 6 years. Those will never come back. Or they could come back with a lot of money, but that I don't see happening. So I think that there's this important role for the nonprofit sector, and I think it has more capacity, and I think government would be well served to sort of help bolster that capacity. And then I think we also need the just the production of the for-profit sector. You know, these are the people who probably built the homes that you're living in right now. And I think we do need that. I think what's also interesting is what we've seen in the last little while is the emergence of groups that are, you know, talking more about their social impact. They're looking at ESG measures. It's not all perfect, and it's not, there's still a ways to go, but I do think that there is more and more willingness to kind of push the boundaries, and often in partnership with government. Like you're seeing groups like Dream who've done some who have worked quite well with the federal government in many cases, but are delivering significant numbers of units that are with that are affordable. So I think we need all of these. We kind of need everybody on this. We keep talking about a housing crisis, and that kind of calls for everyone to step up. And I think we need it across the continuum, basically. That there's no I don't think we should look at it like an either or. I can say from my own personal experience, I think when I first came into this space, there was this kind of, you know, um, rental versus home ownership was sort of the ethos, but we need both, really, and we need great delivery groups, and we need to strengthen the groups that are on the nonprofit side. I think we would all benefit from that.
Thanks, Heather. Chief Gauthier, I wonder if you can speak to this, not to set up this binary, as Heather suggested. It's not that helpful to go and discuss it as either or, but you come at this from a unique perspective here, and you even mentioned kind of your work with your colleagues on other Ontario chiefs connecting to economic development work. How does a profit motive play into how you understand opportunities for affordable housing development for First Nations communities, for example?
Well, I know that we understand that there are there is there are investors, there is a risk, there is a commitment to investing in communities. I'm going to bring up quickly a story of a municipality. I'm not going to point them out. Uh, but name them. But there was a municipality that I visited, and I think 95% of the people the homeless in that community were First Nation, and I think that my concern, I had talked to the mayor of that municipality, and I said, where are the developers? Where are the people who are going to build the structures that people need to live in? Whether or not they're affordable or not. We're the more housing there. There's a trickle down effect that it'll create more affordable housing if there is just general more housing, because the scarcity of housing in certain municipalities are causing these issues around homelessness, and those that are hit hardest are those that are marginalized within in those communities, and unfortunately in that particular community it was First Nations, but it's not always just First Nations. I think that the importance of having those developers out there that are going to be able to spend money, and sometimes it's not, oh, you're not trying to double your money or anything like that, but you're looking for some type of return on your investment. So I think that I'm all for in the days of villainizing people who want to make money, are gone. I think we need to start understanding how we get involved in the market rather than pointing at them and blaming them for all the problems in our communities.
I wonder if
Maybe I
Derek
could
can
just
pick up on this.
elaborate. Yeah.
Oh yeah, sorry,
I
go ahead.
agree with both what Heather and Chief Goshi said. The scale of the problem is we need more of everything. And, I can't verify this, but I saw someone did some math on the scale of the housing that this country is going to need over the next 10 years. And it would cost something like $2 trillion to build it all. I mean, that's you can't even wrap your head around a number that big. Even the federal government, even if they wanted to, doesn't have the resources to do that. And so we need to leverage the private sector to do that. We need governments to be involved, and we need the nonprofit sector to be involved. And that's really about creating that spectrum of affordability and all kinds of different housing types and tenures. All those different organizations that we've talked about today are necessary to create that, and that's what will create more successful communities and make more housing more accessible to more people.
So with that said, I wonder then if we need, I'm going to interpret that as saying we need more of everyone in this room in terms of the projects that you're doing, right? We need more of everything. But those in the audience might be curious because of the particularities of your perspectives and the organizations that you work for or represent, or in the communities that you represent, etc. It strikes me that someone might be listening to this conversation and saying, "Oh, great, this is a panel on partnerships and innovation," but these kind of seem like unicorns here, right? So, Heather described what Options for Home does as kind of an unconventional model. I think that could apply to all of your work to some degree, right? So how do you make that work? You might hear language of how do you make that scale, but I think just more practically, how do you make that work? And one way to come at that maybe, and maybe I'd invite Joshua to kick us off here. The reception that you get when you bring up some of these kind of unconventional ideas. You mentioned at the outset that you came to Habitat and you started to help them think about the rental side of things of the equation, for example, which wasn't normally in the core mandate. How do you turn these kind of unicorn ideas and make the other audience members, I don't mean in this group, but just kind of in the sector, more receptive to these kind of partnerships?
I think maybe I'll break it down into two. So from a personal perspective, I'm hoping for a better world. I have a 4-year-old daughter. The reason I do what I do is because I see things getting a lot worse before they're going to get better. And I want to make sure that by the time she's 20, sorry if I don't move, my lights turn off. If by the time she's 20, she's living in a community that is still kind of the community that I grew up in when I was born in Toronto. From a professional perspective, I think it just takes determination and just a relentlessness that you just don't take no for an answer. So the amount of times that I've been told, like I got into affordable housing working in the nonprofit space with an idea of how to build affordable housing out in Alberta, out west, and I was told it was a terrible idea. And I just got invited back in August to open the doors to a 33-unit modular shipping container project in Banff, Alberta, with the YWCA, which was my first project that I conceived, saying like, let's do it this way. I helped get all the funding and financing together, and there's 33 families that are living a better life today because of that. But what I realized there was just, again, the scale. I was like, wow, it's going to take a lot of these 33 units to get to what we need. So I'm hoping that, I don't know if we're going to see the leadership within government, but I'm hoping that the leadership within this group here and people within these individual industries and representing the different kind of stakeholders that we represent can come together and recognize, like, we want to get on with it. Like Derek and other developers want to build more housing. You know, we want to build more housing. We collectively want to serve more people. And I think that, you know, ultimately you just kind of put your head down and don't take no for an answer. I mean, there's got to be a lot of change in policy to actually make something like to move the needle. But like I said, I think it's going to get worse before it's going to get better. And this did not happen overnight. This has been decades in the making. This isn't one government at one level's problem. This is all the governments. So I think we need a little bit of less politics and you know, more creativity and what we're talking about here today, partnerships and innovation.
Chief Gauthier, do you have a take on this? Because you know, this might have been unconventional thinking in your circles as well. How do you make this work?
Well, I think, like I said before, I think we have to start looking at blue ocean, right? Other opportunities, other thoughts that you know, isn't as competitive as you know, everybody looking at one specific initiative. We have to start thinking out of the box. We have to start thinking uh, um, thinking more imaginative and on how we address these specific issues around you know, the lack of housing. So I think, again, I think we've heard a theme about you know, working together. We use the term partnerships, but it's generally just working together as nations, working together as companies, and working together as industry. So I think that that's one of the things that I see coming out of this discussion. Miigwech.
And Derek, coming to you, and then we'll finish off this question with Heather because you raised the topic in the first place. But Derek, you know, you were mentioning in your opening remarks where you've done substantial outreach about the community groups, but also I'm sure in private sector firms that would be partnering on this kind of very large scale project as well. What, you know, the reception to your plans and ideas, has it always been extremely positive? If not, is it a matter of taking the Joshua approach and not taking no for an answer? How has it been in your case, and how might it apply to other people's experiences, perhaps in the audience as well?
I'll make a few comments. So one on the local context, and you know, I think one of the reasons we've been successful so far at Downsview is because we talked and listened so much before we started making plans and submitting to the city. But and so that speaks to one of the challenges of this problem, is that in order to do it properly and in order to have successful communities, which is obviously where we all want to end up, it has to be relevant for the local context. So there is a risk of like cookie cutter, cut and paste, replicating something over and over and over again, because it's not always going to be relevant to the appropriate local context. And I think that's actually a mistake that we need to avoid. And so that's the problem, is you want to scale things, you want to be able to replicate it, but you can't just do it blindly. You need to understand the local context and what the needs are of the local community before you just start building things. I think one of the big challenges is capacity. So I was talking to someone who was involved in real estate development in the 70s in Toronto. And they talked about the fact that there was a whole bunch of organizations, developers, grassroots organizations that were involved in the delivery of affordable housing of various kinds, rental, ownership, co-op, because there was government programs available and a lot of things were happening. And then all of a sudden, all the funding just disappeared. And so the capacity of the industry, the organizations, those grassroots organizations, it all atrophied. And you know, if there aren't projects to do, all that expertise is going to go on and do something else and eventually disappear. And I think we're now at the point where we're starting to build up that capacity, but it's not something you can just turn on. Same thing happened with public transit infrastructure. We didn't build any subways for so long, and now that we're trying to do it again, we're having a hard time finding all the expertise, the engineers, the trades, everything to deliver that, because if you don't keep that capacity utilized, it goes away. So I do think we're at the point where that capacity building is happening, and I think that's a precondition to being able to do things at scale. And this is a weird thing to say, but I was at the event that Heather was mentioning and co-hosted last night. And one of the comments that Anna Bilau said, which really resonated with me, is this issue is getting headlines now because it's affecting middle-class people. And it wasn't for the longest time because it was only affecting poor people or people without the means to be able to make their voices heard. And I think that, in a weird way, that actually is really helpful, because that's what will get political attention, and that's what will help sustain the capacity building that we need to help really address this problem. So in a weird way, I'm optimistic that sustained interest in capacity building is now building momentum and will continue to build momentum. And that, I think, is the most important thing that we need to be able to really address this problem, because the models are actually there. It's not rocket science. It's resources and capacity, and so these things are starting to happen, and we need more of it. But it will take time to build.
All right, hand it over to Heather here. We had kind of a fairly personal take from Joshua, for example, of how to get how to move the dial on this in terms of personal determination, and Derek's bringing up a lot of systemic changes and large scale, high level changes here. From coming back around, it was your comments saying you were kind of working in an unconventional model. How you've been at this for a while here. Has reception, have you received different are there different attitudes now to when you pitch how you do things with your organization than was in the past? And if so, how has that worked, and how could it work going forward for other types of groups as well who may have unconventional models that they're trying to propose?
Sure. I just wanted to make one comment out of what Derek just said. If I can just, and then I'll answer the question. Those groups that existed in the 70s that kind of delivered all this housing in Toronto, I find it interesting as someone who wasn't, who came to Toronto just 8 years ago, to learn that, options really got born out of that. We were kind of, when the housing money dried up in the 90s, Options was born as a way to work without government funding. So that's kind of how we were born. And another person who was the business partner of the the founder of Options is Mitch Cohen, who obviously went on to Daniels. And you can see in him that kind of the seeds of the co-op sector and the kind of innovation and commitment to affordable housing. So there was tremendous capacity in the sector at that time, and thankfully went off into great places, but it would be great to rebuild that, as there's funds available to seed projects. I think we can rebuild that capacity and maybe focus that capacity. So in terms of the, kind of an answer to the question, I think we have been seen as this kind of bit of a unicorn. And in the early stages, I think, when I stepped into the seat at Options, there was kind of I wouldn't say the water was always warm. And so I think what we just did was, we tried to find audiences for ourselves. And, if we were kind of pitching ideas, we just were a little bit relentless, in some ways. And I think sometimes you prove it out by doing. We are now, when I first came on, I think we had 200 units in a pipeline, and we have over 2,000 now. So you kind of have to, I think, you gain people's trust by doing and delivering in some cases. And I also think that, what's interesting for me when I look back at the start of Options, we were selling units for $300 a square foot, like in the 300s, maybe not 300, but somewhere in the $300 a square foot. Well, That doesn't exist anymore. You know, the top end of the market's $2,500 a square foot in Toronto. You know, even we have a project that's selling now that's almost $800 a square foot. You know, there's been such a rapid change in the market in the last 7 or 8 years, particularly in the last kind of 5 years. And I think, you know, when I look back on it, I start to think that, you know, we talked about a crisis in 2015. This is really, I mean, like I've said before, like, I don't know how you say more crisis, bigger crisis, extreme crisis. But I do think that, you know, I guess the approach I'm taking now is we have to seize the crisis, because we're starting to see more kind of people getting quite creative about how to solve it. Like the Rapid Housing Initiative was really, you know, we have COVID, we need to respond to this. So in some ways, I think we just cannot waste a crisis. Like, this is a bit tactical in terms of strategy, but we do have these crises. We have, you know, the province is trying to move a number of pieces. You know, we can talk about, we don't have time to talk about that necessarily, but there are a lot of pieces moving. I think we've seen kind of really strong responses at the city. I think the Rapid Housing Initiative at the federal level, and I think there's a lot of retooling going on, as I understand right now, within CMHC, and innovation funding on rent to own. So I do think that we just cannot waste this crisis that we're in to really kind of retool what we're doing. And then I think those tools remain in place when hopefully it's not going to be in the short term that we move out of this crisis, but when we do, hopefully we have built some longer term tools to continually deliver housing for people.
Go ahead, Dirk. You want to pick up
Just
on
to
that?
make one quick comment building on what Heather said, not wasting the crisis. I think one of the things that again came up last night, and it's something that we've been really focused on at Northcrest is, which not a lot of people are talking about right now, is the cost of building. And I think it's one thing to talk about sources of funding and how to finance things and how to create partnerships, but we have not been able to make housing cost less in a really long time. And it's a combination of materials, the way we do things. It's not good enough, and it has to get better. And so one of the most important ways that I think we can make housing less expensive is to actually build cheaper housing, like have it actually cost less to build it. There's lots of talk about how we have not improved labor productivity in the construction industry in 70 years. So I think it's one of those things. This is the way we do things. It's the way it's always been done. We're just going to keep doing it the same way. That's not going to cut it anymore. And I think that more and more people need to be focused on that side of the equation, not just trying to find more money to pay for the housing that is just too expensive to build these days.
Do others want to chime in there on something to point out something that we aren't paying enough attention to here in order to seize that crisis, as Heather put it? So Derek brings up construction costs and you know, whether it's materials or construction practices, etc., to make sure those costs get down. Do others have thoughts on this point?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that you know, we talk about affordable housing and what can be done at the city level, but at the end of the day, we have a housing strategy that is not tied to immigration. I think there was an article that they talked about bringing in kind of a record number of new immigrants into the country over the next 5 years. You know, my wife is an immigrant. I believe in immigration. The challenge is that we're setting people up for failure when they arrive. If we're not building, if, you know, population growth and through immigration or other means is exceeding the amount of homes we're building, there's a fundamental problem, and it's not that hard to comprehend. So from a federal perspective, I think the simple thing they could do is actually, from a policy perspective, align immigration and housing as a first starter. This was touched on earlier, but if you eliminate all the zoning limitations and said, you know what, build as much as you can, as quickly as you can. Here's all the money in the world. Here's, build as high as you can. The challenge is we don't have the workers to build it. So if we're not investing in trades and workforce development at a provincial level, that's another issue. And then, from again, this is reiterating what I think what Heather was touching on, the nonprofit sector from my perspective, we get a lot of capital dollars for projects, or we get capital dollars for project, but there's no investment in the sector itself, in terms of succession planning, and building a more resilient sector. And I think that I think the private sector has a really important role to play, but I think if you eliminated the nonprofit sector, I think that would be a huge loss to our communities and to individuals who depend on, and I'm not just talking about housing, I'm just talking about in general. So if we don't invest in making sure that we have a resilient nonprofit sector, it's going to get really difficult. And I think this is across the country. And I think the last thing I'll say is, like, look, there's new, whether it's new programs like rent to own from the federal government, or co-investment, or one of the many bills that the province is rolling out, all of these at points feel like band-aid solutions, and we're like ignoring the bigger issue. So opening up the green belt is not going to solve affordable housing. The issue of affordable housing is that like within the confines of outside of the green belt, like we need better processes in terms of, we need more density, we need less kind of red tape, and expedite processes. So how are we actually going to do that? Well, the City of Toronto, the challenge that they've faced is that they're hemorrhaging planning staff like it's going out of style, and that's because there's been a freeze on wages, and there hasn't been an investment there. So if we're going to expedite planning and see that move faster, you need people to do that. And unfortunately, the city's going to have to compete with the nonprofit and the private sector to get good planning staff, so that they can actually approve applications. So there's just, it's a systemic problem that goes from the top to the bottom. And I think that, again, I think it's going to get a lot worse before it's going to get better. And I think that people will continue to play politics, and I think there will become a point where enough is enough, and people will start saying, they're done. And I think the other big thing that we're not really taking into consideration is the generational change. In the City of Toronto and Canada, the millennial population by 2030 will be the largest voting bloc, and the boomers, which have been, will no longer be. So I think that will be an interesting. It'll be interesting to see how that impacts elections, but also policy. Sorry, a lot there to unpack.
Yeah, and I think it's great that we're kind of just organically moving to some takeaways here for our audience of things that they need to be thinking about in terms of how to seize this crisis. Maybe come back to Heather on this point before we finish up with Chief Gauthier. You can take it in whatever direction you want in terms of expanding on how you think we should be seizing this crisis, or being very practical and specific about things that either one order of government or another needs to be doing in order to help organizations like yours seize this crisis.
Yeah, I think the way or one of the ways forward would be, and I talked about this a little bit, is we really need to grow the pie of the resources that are available to deliver housing. And I do think that is a conversation that could be productive by all three levels of government. I think what we saw in some of the, there wasn't new funding available from the province, rather kind of a recently, but more of a shifting of, kind of speed up the process or whatever. But ultimately, we all know that there's more funding needed in this area, or more capital. Federal government doesn't have enough money to do this. I think we need to look at how you bring new capital into this space. And they have the capacity and the tools to provide guarantees and other mechanisms that could incentivize tax structures, that could incentivize new funds coming into the affordable housing space, or the housing space in general. So I do think that that's the productive conversation to be had here, amongst all levels of government, to use their powers in ways that maybe they haven't historically, but I think is much necessary at this point in time.
Wonderful. And Chief Gauthier, what do you take from this? What needs to happen?
Well, I think that what needs to happen is, again, we need to push for investment in people, right? Like, I think that, I hear all the time that there's an issue with a disparity for those that don't have money to invest in their own house, and in incentivizing. I mean, if you're going to look specifically at short term solutions, then we need those incentives in order to start the ball rolling. An object in motion tends to stay in motion. So I think we need to start making those investments so that in the future, we'll have long-term gains for these short-term investments.
I think that might be a nice place to wrap things up, actually, because if anything, one of the things I took from this conversation is that there's a lot of good ideas here that will help get the ball rolling for those in attendance, and hopefully we've helped make some connections between some of our panelists as well. So making sure that we respect everyone's time, this might be an opportunity here to wrap things up and express my appreciation on behalf of the entire panel, as well as the Secretary at the City. So again, Chief Gauthier, Heather Tremaine, Joshua Bernard, and Derek Goring, thank you all for your insights today, as well as the City of Toronto's Housing Secretary, Mercedes, Kira, and the rest of the team who I had the pleasure to meet. Thank you for putting this panel together. I know I learned a lot. I suspect the audience, the silent audience that is out there somewhere, then I don't know how many they are, but they're there. And they are listening, and we thank you for your attention throughout. For those who couldn't attend or missed a couple of portions, you can pass on the notes that are recording this session. I believe will be posted on the Toronto website, toronto.ca/HousingSummit. So be sure to check that out if you've missed anything, or you want to get some great quotes from this session. And then also, I would be remiss if I didn't point out as well for the rest of the team that later today, as well as tomorrow, there's another couple of interesting panels coming up. One, the future of rental housing at 2:30 p.m. And then tomorrow on housing, health, and justice. So check those out and keep these ideas swimming in your mind as we continue thinking through ways, as Heather put it, to seize this crisis. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, sharing your insights and participating in a really extraordinary and interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.